Hi everybody, this is Here with the Birds back with another Shadowlands video, and in this video I'd like to look at 4 distinct playstyles for Holy Paladin that I see going to be viable going into Shadowlands. My focus today is on PvE content and specifically for raids, though I think a few of these builds are quite viable in Mythic Plus. Let's get going. 4 major builds that we're going to consider are the melee Glimmer build, which is fairly popular right now. It's probably the go-to build that most people would suggest going into Shadowlands. Second to that is a melee caster build where you start to think about using Holy Light. And then we have a couple experimental builds. One is a range build that I've been thinking about that helps to build from range and you don't need to be Crusader striking. It simplifies some of those pieces. And then a melee Martyr build that I've been thinking about for the last few weeks that foregoes using things like Light of Dawn. It doesn't use Holy Light or Flash of Light, instead filling the rotation with Martyr. The Glimmer build is quite common because it's quite straightforward. The goal is to cast as many Holy Shocks as you possibly can. So we're going to reset that with Crusader's Might. We're going to make use of things like Holy Avenger and extend the duration through our 45 talent of our main cooldown, Avenging Wrath. Essentially reducing the CDR on Holy Shock any way we possibly can so that we can cover the whole raid with Holy Shocks. There are 2 main buttons you want to be focused on in this build. Obviously Holy Shock, but second to that, Crusader Strike. And weaving the 2 together so that you don't overcap or have a Holy Shock ready to go and you press Crusader Strike, therefore wasting the CDR you get, is a core component of this build. Other than that, you're going to be doing all the normal things that Paladins do, casting your hammer, doing consecration in melee, bopping people, lay on hands, the whole kit. And the goal here is just to try to replicate some of that BFA playstyle by popping as many glimmers on your companions as you possibly can, keeping the raid healthy in that sort of a way. It's a fairly simple and straightforward build, and this one is really good for Mythic Plus as well. So those of you who are thinking about doing high Mythic keys on a Paladin, you should probably start with your melee Glimmer build and go from there, modulating it as you need. The major legendaries that we're going to want for Glimmer are the Divine Toll combined with Shock Barrier. So we're going to take Kyrian and we're going to look at maximizing the value of all the Holy Shocks that we cast. Divine Toll, of course, casts 5 Holy Shocks on a 1-minute cooldown, and this is really strong for this build, particularly when you combine it with Shock Barrier. On the conduit side, we're going to take a look at Ringing Clarity, which again is doubling down on our Holy Shock usage on one of the targets. We might be thinking about using Focused Light to get the most value and make sure that all of our Holy Shocks are critting. And then on the endurance side, likely the best candidate at the moment is Shielding Words. Even though we're going to probably be splitting our time casting Light of Dawn and Word of Glory, at least you're getting some more value out of your holy power spenders. The next build is the melee caster build, which is the second most common build that people are talking about going into Shadowlands. And part of the reason for that is that it basically has the same principles of producing as many holy power as procs as you can through Crusader Strike, while leaning a little bit more towards Holy Light play. Holy Light, of course, is a really big bomb. It's slow to cast, but there are a couple of pieces in the borrowed power that are going to emphasize its use. So we're going to move away from Crusader's Might because we don't get as much value out of it due to the long cast time of Holy Light. Instead, we'll take Bestow Faith. That gives us more holy power. It's a nice hot that we can cast that I guess only ticks once, but it's after an expiration time. We still might take Judgment of Light, but also Prism could potentially work here as well. And I think Glimmer is still likely the go-to for the Holy Light build, though there may be some niche moments where Beacon of Faith or Virtue are useful if you need certain kinds of throughput. The basic buttons that you're going to be concerned with in the melee caster build are Holy Shock, Bestow Faith, and then Crusader striking to give yourself more holy power. While you're not doing that, or when you get a proc from infusion, you're going to want to cast Holy Light on injured targets. One of the differences between this build and some of the others is that your holy power generation is not really going to come from your main spell Holy Light, unless of course you're casting that on a target with Beacon. It presents a little bit of tension for the build, since sometimes the party member who needs to be healed with Holy Light doesn't have Beacon and therefore is not helping you generate power. So that's why we're in melee, in part to make sure that our Crusader Strike is also filling in those gaps and making sure we're generating enough power to be effective as a healer. In this build, we're going to still make use of Divine Toll, but instead, Shock Barrier, we're going to take a look at Inflorescence. Inflorescence of the Sunwell is unique in that it's going to buff up our infusion of light, giving us an additional charge of it and increasing its effects by 20%. So that means every time we get an infusion, we're going to want to cast 2 Holy Lights before we shock again. So there's this pattern of going back and forth between the two, filling in with Crusader Strikes and Bestow Faith to help maximize our efficiency. This Holy Light is quite strong, especially when we combine it with some of the conduits that we're going to consider. Specifically, the Resplendent Light conduit, which is going to splash the healing from our Holy Light onto other targets. This is going to vastly improve the throughput of Holy Light as the expansion goes on and as we start to scale up this conduit. I think, again, the last conduit still is probably likely going to be an endurance conduit here, giving us, again, a little bit of a shield whenever we cast Word of Glory. The next build I want to consider is this unique kind of range caster build. And it plays with some of the same principles as the melee caster version, except that we're going to be filling things in a little bit differently. We don't have access to the boss since we're not in melee, so we're going to have a bit of a different strategy. Holy Shock, Bestow Faith still on the table. We're going to add Prism in as a talent to give us another button to press. And then instead of Holy Lights, we're going to largely fill things with Flash of Light. Now the goal of this build is to have high amounts of uptime on our Holy Power. Flash of Light is a fairly quick cast. We can pump out a lot of Holy Power generation if we cast it on a beacon. So the goal of this build is to be at ranged, or to function when we can't reliably be hitting the boss, and make use of all of the Holy Power generation from Crusader Strike. And instead, we're going to generate Holy Power casting Flash of Light exclusively, usually on the tanks or our beacon target, and casting everything else we possibly can on some other target. So our shocks, our Bestow Faith, and then our filler Holy Prism and Word of Glory, of course, as a spender. One of the advantages of this build is that you don't have to be in melee. You can move around, and it actually generates more Holy Power per second than our melee caster build. You don't have that clunkiness of not having a heal going out and needing to press Crusader Strike in order to generate power. But you're going to rightly say, well, hold on a second, this build looks like garbage. The mana, what are we going to do with the mana issue? And I'm just going to refer you to Inflorescence one more time. This build will make use of Inflorescence not on the benefit you get from the really slow Holy Light cast, but on the mana reduction side of it that is given to Flash of Light. So you'll have a pattern of going Holy Shock into a couple of Flash of Lights when you get the Infusion of Light buff. Those would be sort of cost-reduced, 50% cost-reduced Flash of Lights. Makes them, in some ways, fairly cost-efficient. I think the mana is something like 200 mana cost for casting those on the target. Of course, we need to make sure we cast those two on a beacon target, so you will have to watch where you're casting and what you're doing. But the speed of these casts, especially when you get infusion, is going to make this something of a viable build going forward in Shadowlands. In addition to Inflorescence of the Sunwell, we're going to pick up Ringing Clarity and Focus Light. Focus Light, of course, is helping to guarantee that every time we press Holy Shock, we are going to critical strike. When we do so, we get an infusion of the light proc, so helps to round out the build a little bit and make it a bit more consistent. Once you've scaled Focus Light, you'll see that almost every single cast of Holy Shock, once you get some gear, is going to make sure that your flash of lights are cheap. And then finally, again, I think in Shielding Words there's a bit of a theme going on here, but it's also going to be the go-to endurance conduit, just giving us the most value as you scale this ability for casting Word of Glory. One of the advantages of being at range, of course, is that we can be helpful as a healer to the ranged group. We don't necessarily actually have to be physically at range necessarily for this to work, but it's just a useful way for us to build holy power when we're away from the boss. We can use Rule of Law to extend our mastery so that we affect everybody, and we can maybe get more targets to hit who are very hurt with our Light of Dawns in case we need it. And finally we have the Melee Martyr build. And this is a build that I've been working on for the last few weeks, and it has some distinctive pieces to it. But the Melee Martyr build, like the other two Melee builds, is trying to use Crusader's Might to reset Holy Shock. So we're going to be valuing Holy Shock, Crusader Strike. But instead of filling the build by spending our Holy Power on Light of Dawn, we're going to exclusively look at a spot healing type of healer. So we're going to do triage work with Word of Glory, topping off and stabilizing people who are about to die. And Martyr actually has some interesting interactions as far as this is concerned. So in this build on the talent side, we're just looking for all the spells that are going to allow us to cast Holy Shock and Crusader Strike. We're going to stay away from Bestow Faith and Holy Prism because they chew up our GCDs. And we're going to think about Beacon of Faith and Beacon of Virtue instead of Glimmer. Glimmer's still really good for the Martyr build, but I think one of the excellent parts of this build is we can pour a lot of our spot healing into the tanks by having both tanks beaconed. You can see me in this video clip martyring the guard over there just as an explanation for how it goes. You can see my health going down. People often have a bad view of Martyr because it kills yourself and they don't see how that can be ever useful in a raid. But a lot of the tools that we're adding on with the borrowed power help us to make use of Martyr, and it becomes a really awesome throughput spell. So we're going to be making use of Divine Toll and Shock Barrier with the Melee Martyr build in order to generate more holy power, to produce shields on people just like in the Melee Glimmer build. And then we're going to use Ringing Clarity alongside Untempered Dedication. Now there is a build that uses Marauders so that our Light of Dawns will make our next Martyr cast really big, but that's not actually very useful for this build because you have to press Light of Dawn instead of topping people off with a Word of Glory, and you have to wait a whole GCD to cast your Martyr on a person who's about to die. But if you use Untempered Dedication just on its own, the scaling offers you some really interesting interactions. So if we build up to 5 stacks, we make for a really heavy hitting Martyr. And 5 stacks isn't that difficult to keep up, it just means we have to Martyr once every 15 seconds. With 5 stacks, of course, you're going to be doing a lot of damage to yourself. This can be reduced through DR, things like Devotion Aura, Aura Mastery, our own Divine Protection, our own Divine Shield. All of these things are going to impact the self-damage that comes to us from Martyr. So the basic playstyle, again, is going to be Shocking and Crusader Striking, weaving these two back and forth, and then just finding targets in your raid who are very injured and spot healing them back to full. You're weaving your Light of the Martyr, doing the same thing all along. The beauty of this build, of course, is that there are no cast time spells being used at all, and we can kind of get away with the self-damage that's coming out because we are leaning a little bit more into Shielding Words. Shielding Words is going to give us a fairly significant shield over the course of a fight because we are exclusively using Word of Glory in this build as a spot healer. Those are the 4 builds that I've been thinking about, guys, as potentially viable builds. going into Shadowlands. I'm just going to put up on the screen as we close this video off the basic talent setup that I see for each of them. You can see here we have the Glimmer build, Martyr build, the melee caster build, and the ranged caster. There's lots of options for each of them, especially in the last tiers. If you need Avenging Crusader, I don't really recommend it because none of the builds really support leaning that far toward Judgment and Crusader Strike. But there's lots of value in potentially extending through Sanctified Wrath or doubling down through Divine Purpose and Awakening to give yourself some stats and some crit, especially early on in the expansion. These 4 builds, of course, have varying popularity. I think Glimmer and the melee caster builds are the most popular, and they're probably the most accessible. But if that's not the style you really like and you'd like to take a look at some other options, please consider the ranged caster build, where you're focusing a little bit more on really cheap flash of light casts, or the melee martyr build, where you're moving away entirely from some of the key pieces of our kit and leaning really far into heavy triage healing. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and we will catch you again next time. Have a good day.